Before you drifted off to sleep last night, what were your final thoughts? Perhaps you scrolled through the hollow light of a phone, chasing one last distraction. Perhaps you worried about a deadline, an unpaid bill, a conversation you wish had gone differently. Our modern anxieties are ghosts of our own making, born from electricity and expectation. But I want you to imagine a different kind of darkness. A darkness so complete, so profound, it felt like a physical presence. Imagine a world without streetlights, without humming refrigerators, where the only light after sunset was the flickering hearth or the distant, indifferent moon. This was the world of our medieval ancestors. And for them, the coming of night was not a gentle reprieve. It was a descent, a journey into an alien country where the border between the living and the dead, the holy and the damned, grew terrifyingly thin. Sleep for them was not a simple biological function. It was a spiritual ordeal, a social ritual, and a perilous voyage undertaken every single night. It was a state of being so utterly different from our own that to understand it is to realize we have forgotten the very language of the dark. Their nights were not silent, but filled with the snores of strangers, the rustle of straw, the grunt of a nearby pig. Their sleep was not a solid 8-hour block, but a broken, fragmented thing, split in two by a strange and sacred waking hour. Tonight, we are not talking about history. We are talking about the soul. We are pulling back the threadbare, flea-bitten blanket of the past to uncover the bizarre, horrific, and forgotten world of medieval sleep. We will explore a time when people slept in shifts, when beds were battlefields of filth and family, and when every dream was a potential message from God or a visitation from the devil. This is the story of how our ancestors survived the night, and in it, we may just find a disquieting reflection of the quiet we have lost. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, the farmers, the laborers, the serfs whose lives were tethered to the rhythm of the sun, the end of the day was not a gentle winding down. It was a collapse. Labor was brutal, a relentless assault on the body from sunup to sundown. When darkness finally fell, it brought with it a weariness so profound it was like a physical weight, and so they surrendered to it. This was not the gentle, cozy sleep we romanticize. This was the first sleep, a deep, often dreamless plunge into oblivion that typically began not long after dusk. Think of it less as drifting off and more as a kind of drowning, a necessary surrender to exhaustion that historian A. Roger E. Kirch, in his groundbreaking work, identified as a dominant pattern of sleep for millennia. People didn't tuck themselves in. They were claimed by the darkness, often falling asleep in the very clothes they had toiled in all day, huddled together for warmth around the dying embers of a central fire. This two-part sleep cycle, known as segmented or biphasic sleep, wasn't a choice. It was the natural default state of humanity in a world ruled by the sun. Without the pervasive, aggressive glare of artificial light to disrupt our internal clocks, the body would naturally fall into this rhythm. After about 4 hours of this heavy, restorative slumber, something remarkable would happen. People would wake up. And this waking was not the jarring, anxiety-fueled insomnia of the modern world. It was a calm, expected, and structured part of the night. This period, lasting for an hour or two around midnight, was known simply as the watch. It was a strange and unique psychological space, a pocket of time that existed between the two sleeps, a world away from the demands of the day. Literary and historical records are filled with casual references to it. Chaucer's characters in the Canterbury Tales make plans to act after their first sleep. A 16th-century French physician noted that laborers and artisans made love to their wives after their first sleep, believing it resulted in healthier children. This wasn't a medical anomaly. It was the accepted and expected texture of life. Monks, nobles, and peasants alike all navigated their nights in this divided fashion. But the watch was more than just a biological curiosity. It was a time of profound duality. On the one hand, it offered a silence and solitude impossible to find during the crowded, laborious day. It was a time for quiet contemplation, for mending a tool by the soft glow of the fire, for a whispered conversation with a spouse without the children underfoot. It was an hour of introspection, a brief window to simply be in a life that was otherwise defined by doing. Yet, this quiet was also laced with a deep and abiding fear. The medieval night was not empty. It was populated. Theologians warned that midnight was the hour when demonic activity was at its peak, when the veil between the mortal realm and the infernal was at its thinnest. It was a time when witches were thought to gather, when evil spirits roamed the frozen fields, and when the lonely soul was most vulnerable to temptation. To be awake in the heart of darkness was to be acutely aware of one's own fragility, both physical and spiritual. The fire could die out, leaving the family to freeze. A strange noise from the animal pen could signal a wolf or a thief. A lingering cough from a child could be the first sign of a fatal illness. The watch was a time of peace, yes, but it was a peace held on the edge of a knife. This was the midnight world our ancestors inhabited, a forgotten chapter of the night where life, prayer, and fear all mingled in the dark. As the household stirred from its first heavy slumber, the world was transformed. The watch was not a groggy interruption, but a functioning part of the day, a third act played out in the deep, quiet theatre of the night. For the peasant family, this hour was one of practical necessity. The fire, the lifeblood of the home, needed to be tended. A log would be added, the embers coaxed back to life, pushing the oppressive animal cold back to the corners of their small one-room dwelling. This was the time to check on the livestock, who often shared the same space, their warm bodies a vital source of heat. A cow's soft breathing, or the rustle of chickens, was a reassuring sound in the immense silence. But this was also a time of profound spiritual activity, born from the terror of what the darkness held. For the medieval mind, the night was a battlefield for the soul. The waking period of the watch was seen as a divine opportunity to arm oneself against the legions of hell that prowled the midnight hour. People would use this time for prayer, not the gentle recited bedtime prayers of modern children, but a desperate and focused plea for protection. They would pray against the noctis equi, the nightmares, demonic entities believed to sit on a sleeper's chest and induce terrifying dreams or even death. They would recite psalms to ward off succubi and incubi, lustful demons who preyed on the sleeping. This was also a time for introspection and confession. Medical and religious texts of the period often linked the body's humors. After the first sleep, the body was considered rested, the mind clear, and digestion complete. This made it the perfect time to contemplate one's sins. To lie awake in the dark, with the day's transgressions replaying in the mind, was a common and encouraged spiritual exercise. You were alone with God and your conscience. This period was also, paradoxically, intensely social and intimate. Freed from the rigid social structures and constant labor of the day, people connected on a different level. Neighbors might share a quiet word if their homes were close enough. A husband and wife could speak of worries or hopes in a low murmur. And yes, this was universally considered the ideal time for procreation. Medieval physicians, like the 16th century French doctor Laurent Joubert, wrote extensively on the subject, arguing that sex during the watch was not only more pleasurable, but more effective. The body was rested, the mind was calm, and therefore it was the best time to conceive strong, healthy offspring. This wasn't about romance in the modern sense. It was a practical, almost agricultural approach to family, rooted in the rhythms of the body. For the upper classes, the watch looked different. A nobleman might use the time to read by candlelight, a rare and expensive luxury, or to go over accounts and letters. His wife might engage in quiet embroidery or prayer. In monasteries, this period was not optional. It was the heart of their spiritual discipline. Monks would rise for matins and lauds, the midnight prayer services, their chants echoing in the cold, cavernous stone of the chapel. For them, sacrificing sleep was a direct offering to God, a conscious denial of the flesh to elevate the spirit. But no matter one's station, the watch was a shared universal experience, a secret world that existed for centuries, hidden from the sun. It was a time when the practical, the spiritual, and the intimate all converged. People would brew small beer, a weak, low-alcohol beverage, to drink during this time. They would consume leftover bits of food, a midnight snack to carry them through to the dawn. Some would simply sit by the fire and think. Imagine an entire society with a built-in period for quiet contemplation every single night, an hour of stillness woven into the very fabric of their existence. It was a world we have utterly lost, a rhythm we have traded for the unbroken, monolithic block of modern sleep. We view a 2 a.m. waking as a sign of disorder, of anxiety. For them, it was simply time to live. And then, as the hour passed and the fire burned low, they would return to their beds for the second sleep, a lighter slumber that would last until the first grey light of dawn broke the horizon, signaling the return of labour and the end of the strange midnight kingdom of the watch. If you could travel back to a medieval peasant's home and ask to see the bed, they would likely look at you with confusion. The concept of a private, comfortable, dedicated piece of furniture for sleeping was a luxury so far beyond their reality it would barely register. For the vast majority of people, a bed was not a place, it was a pile. And that pile was a teeming, rustling, and often horrific microcosm of medieval life itself. The foundation of this sleeping world was the pallet, a sack made of rough, coarse fabric, if you were lucky enough to own one, stuffed with whatever was available. Most commonly this was straw or hay. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it provided a crucial layer of insulation against the cold, damp earth or stone floor. But this humble mattress was also a thriving ecosystem. It was a haven for fleas, lice, bedbugs, and mites. It was a nesting place for mice and a hiding spot for beetles. To sleep on a straw pallet was to enter into a nightly truce with a menagerie of biting, crawling creatures. The constant itching and the subtle feeling of something moving across your skin was not a cause for alarm. It was the baseline of existence. This lack of comfort was so profound, it was often incorporated into the spiritual worldview of the time. The misery of the bed was a physical reminder of the fallen state of humanity, a kind of nightly penance. The flea's bite was not just an irritation. Some theologians framed it as a messenger of God, a tiny thorn in the flesh to prevent one from becoming too comfortable in a world of sin and suffering. The bed was, in a very real sense, a sermon delivered in filth. But the most alien aspect of the medieval bed was not its contents but its occupants. Privacy was a concept reserved for God, and perhaps the highest nobility. For everyone else, sleep was a communal act. The entire family, parents, children, grandparents, and often an orphaned cousin or a visiting laborer, would sleep together in a single shared space, often on the same sprawling pile of straw. This was not about sentimentality, it was about survival. Huddling together was a crucial strategy for conserving body heat in the drafty, uninsulated hovels that passed for homes. Within this human nest, there was a strict, unspoken hierarchy. The center of the pile, the warmest and safest spot, was usually reserved for the heads of the household or for the most vulnerable, like infants. The edges, colder and more exposed to drafts and pests, were for the young, the unmarried, or those of the lowest status. To be pushed to the edge of the bed pile was a physical manifestation of your place in the world, and it wasn't just humans. As we've mentioned, livestock were often brought inside during the coldest months. A family might share its sleeping space with chickens, a goat, or the family pig. The dog, a source of immense warmth, was a prized bedfellow. Waking up to a hoof in the ribs or a chicken pecking at your hair was simply part of the nightly routine. For travelers, the situation was even more precarious. The medieval inn did not offer private rooms. It offered a space in a bed. A weary merchant arriving late at night would be directed to a large bed already occupied by 2, 3, or even 4 complete strangers. These were not quaint 4-poster beds. They were enormous wooden frames, sometimes 10 feet across, layered with straw mattresses and shared by whoever paid for a spot. Snoring, flatulence, and the stench of unwashed bodies were a given. The real fears were theft and disease. Travelers often slept with their coin purses tied around their necks or hidden deep within their clothes. They would use their own bundles as a pillow, a crude but effective alarm system. Sharing a bed with a stranger who had a suspicious cough or weeping boils was a gamble that could easily end in death. Court records from the period are filled with lurid tales of travelers being murdered in their sleep by their anonymous bedfellows, their bodies disposed of before the sun rose. Of course, the nobility slept differently, but even their beds were not the private sanctuaries we imagine. A lord's bed was a massive, ornate piece of furniture, often canopied and curtained, not for privacy, but to keep out the drafts and the dust falling from the rafters. These beds were so valuable, they were key items in wills, passed down through generations like land titles. but even a lord and lady rarely slept alone. It was common for personal servants, ladies-in-waiting, or a trusted guard to sleep on smaller pallets or benches at the foot of their master A.S. bed. The room was never truly private. The idea of sealing oneself off from the world to sleep was seen as strange, antisocial, and even dangerous. In the medieval world, to be alone was to be vulnerable. To sleep, therefore, was to do so in the messy, loud, and often unpleasant company of others. In our centrally heated world, we think of sleepwear as a matter of comfort or style. Pajamas, nightgowns, or nothing at all, it is a personal choice. In the Middle Ages, what you wore to bed was not a choice. It was a strategy, a desperate, multi-layered defense in a relentless war against an enemy that seeped through every wall and whistled through every crack, the cold. Medieval architecture was a masterpiece of faith, not insulation. The majestic stone walls of a castle and the wattle and daub construction of a peasant hut had one thing in common: they were spectacularly inefficient at retaining heat. Windows, if they existed at all, were unglazed openings covered by wooden shutters, or for the slightly more affluent, thin, oiled parchment or polished animal horn that let in a pale, milky light but did little to stop the wind. Drafts were not minor annoyances. They were aggressive physical presences, believed to carry not just cold but also sickness and malevolent spirits, the so-called evil airs. In this environment, keeping warm at night was a matter of life and death, and the primary battleground was the head. Based on the long-held, though now scientifically disputed, belief that most body heat escapes through the scalp, the single most important piece of nocturnal armor was the humble nightcap. This was not a fashion accessory, it was an essential tool. The iconic image of a long, pointed, floppy cap, often ending in a tassel, is not a caricature. It was a practical design, usually made from wool or thick linen, designed to trap a pocket of warm air around the head. For a peasant, it might be a simple, undyed scrap of fabric. For a wealthy merchant, it could be made of finer linen, perhaps dyed with a costly color to reflect his status even in slumber. But the nightcap was more than just a personal heater. It was imbued with deep social and cultural meaning. In many parts of Europe, it was a marker of domesticity and order. For a married woman, wearing a coif or cap to cover her hair was a requirement of modesty at all times, even in sleep. To be seen with her hair uncovered was an act of impropriety. The cap, therefore, was a symbol of her marital status and her household's piety, worn day and night. The nightcap also functioned as a social signal. In more urban settings, to answer your door wearing a nightcap was the medieval equivalent of saying, "I'm off duty, go away." It was a clear visual boundary that marked the end of the public day and the beginning of private domestic time. It was a uniform of rest, a small flag of truce raised against the demands of the world. Below the head, the strategy continued. Most common people did not own dedicated sleepwear. Pajamas were a foreign concept, centuries away from being introduced to Europe. People simply slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, perhaps loosening a belt or removing their outer tunic. This was practical. It saved on laundry, which was an arduous and expensive process, and it meant one was always ready to leap out of bed to tend a firefight off a thief or answer a call of nature in the cold. The typical sleeping garment was the chemise or smock, a long, shapeless under-tunic made of linen or rough wool that was worn by both men and women. Think of Ebenezer Scrooge in his nightshirt and cap. That was the standard practical uniform of the medieval knight. It was itchy, often infested with lice, and, being close to the fire, occasionally flammable. For the nobility, things were slightly more refined. A wealthy lady might have a dedicated night rail, a long flowing gown of fine bleached linen, perhaps with some simple embroidery at the collar. A lord might have a similar nightshirt. But even this was more about hygiene, keeping the sweat and grime of the body from soiling the expensive sheets and blankets, than it was about comfort. Sleepwear was never sexy. It was purely functional. And its primary function, along with the cap, the heavy wool blankets, and the bodies of your 5 closest relatives, was to form a fragile, permeable barrier in the unending nightly war against the cold. It was one more layer in the constant, exhausting effort to simply survive until morning. In the modern world, we have domesticated the dream. We dismiss it as a random firing of synapses, our brain's messy filing system, or the strange byproduct of a late-night meal. We might share a particularly odd dream with a partner, laugh about it, and then forget it by noon. But in the medieval world, to dream was to open a door, and you were never certain who or what might walk through it. Dreams were not nonsense. They were communications. They were considered a direct, unfiltered channel through which the supernatural world spoke to the sleeping soul. This belief turned every night into a high-stakes spiritual event. A dream was not merely a product of your own mind. It was a message from God, a warning from a saint, a temptation from the devil, or even a prophecy sent through the restless spirit of a dead relative. Theologians, monks, and scholars dedicated immense effort to the practice of oneiromancy, the formal interpretation of dreams. Entire books, known as dream manuals, circulated among the literate, providing complex glossaries for decoding the soul's nightly theatre. These interpretations were not vague. They were specific and often terrifying. To dream of clear water might signify purity or divine grace, but to dream of muddy water could foretell sickness or spiritual pollution. Dreaming of flying could be a sign of pride, one of the 7 deadly sins planted by a demon to tempt you. A dream of a black dog might be a literal manifestation of a demonic entity. Even a simple anxiety dream, one we might recognize today, was fraught with eternal consequence. If you dreamt that your teeth were falling out, it wasn't a sign of stress. It was a divine premonition that a loved one was about to die. This framework placed an immense psychological burden on the individual. Your inner world was not private. It was a public and spiritual battleground. A disturbing or lustful dream could not be shaken off. It had to be confessed to a priest, as it was believed that your soul was still active and culpable while your body slept. The dream revealed a hidden weakness, a crack in your spiritual armor that a demon had exploited. The prescription might be prayer, fasting, or a specific penance to purify the soul from the dream's stain. You could be held accountable for the sins you committed in your sleep. The dreams of the powerful in particular were treated as matters of state. The chronicles of the Middle Ages are filled with accounts of kings and bishops whose dreams were believed to foretell the outcome of battles, the birth of heirs, or the coming of plague. A king who dreamt of a withered tree before a major campaign might call off the entire invasion, believing it to be a divine omen of failure. These were not seen as superstitions, but as prudent and necessary acts of governance, guided by the hand of God. Of course, the Church remained deeply suspicious. While divine revelation through dreams was possible, it was far more likely, they taught, that a dream was a demonic illusion. The devil was the master of trickery, and the dreamscape was his favorite workshop. He could appear as an angel of light, offering what seemed to be holy visions that were, in fact, designed to lead the soul into pride or heresy. This created a terrible paradox. You were commanded to pay attention to your dreams, but to trust them was to risk damnation. This fear made the very act of falling asleep an act of faith, and for many, an act of terror. You were willingly surrendering your conscious mind and allowing your soul to wander into a realm where it could be ambushed. Bedtime prayers took on a desperate urgency. People didn't just pray for rest, they prayed for protection from rest, asking specific saints, like Saint Christopher, the patron of travelers, to guard their souls on their nightly journey. For our medieval ancestors, the monsters weren't under the bed, they were waiting behind their eyelids. Sleep wasn't an escape, it was an encounter, and you never knew if you would wake up saved or already condemned. The world we have explored tonight, a world of segmented sleep, of communal beds teeming with life and filth, of midnight prayers whispered against demonic fears, feels like a distant, almost unbelievable country. It is a world where the night was not a void to be passed through, but a landscape to be navigated, full of its own rules, its own society, and its own profound terrors and graces. Sleep was not a private retreat, but a shared, public, and spiritually charged ordeal. The straw pallet, the flea's bite, the stranger's snore, the waking watch, these were the universal textures of life for 1,000 years. And then, in the blink of a historical eye, we erased it. The Industrial Revolution, with its factories that demanded a new kind of human discipline, and the invention of gaslighting, which pushed the darkness into the alleys and corners, conspired to kill the old ways of the night. The segmented sleep cycle, that natural, ancient rhythm, was seen as inefficient, unproductive. A worker who woke at midnight was not being pious. He was wasting valuable time that could be spent resting for the factory floor. Slowly, then all at once, society began to enforce a new tyranny, the 8-hour uninterrupted block of sleep. It was presented as progress, as scientific, as healthy. We were taught to view waking in the night as a disorder, a failure of the body to conform. The watch, that sacred hour of quiet contemplation, was medicalized and renamed sleep maintenance insomnia. The communal bed was replaced by the private bedroom, a symbol of middle-class aspiration. We traded the warmth and squalor of the human pile for the sterile, cold isolation of our individual mattresses. We gained much in this transition, there is no doubt. We gained hygiene, privacy, and a world where the night is no longer a realm of existential terror. We have conquered the darkness with our ever-present electric light, but in this conquest we must ask ourselves what we have lost. We lost that strange liminal space in the heart of the night, a time outside of time, dedicated to prayer, thought, or simply being. We lost a deep and instinctual connection to the natural rhythms of the planet, to the cycles of light and dark. And perhaps, in our quiet, temperature-controlled rooms, we lost a certain kind of raw, unfiltered intimacy, the profound, unspoken bond that comes from huddling together against the cold and the dark. Our ancestors' nights were brutal, short, and filled with fear, but they were also in their own way more connected, to each other, to their faith, and to the vast, untamed mystery of the dark. We have sanitized the night, made it safe and predictable. But in doing so, we may have forgotten how to truly live in it. We have inherited their dawn, but we have surrendered their dusk. And the silent, forgotten kingdom of the watch remains lost to us, a ghost in our own biology, a dream from which we have forced ourselves to awaken.